All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. I'm Katie Earle. I'm the coordinator of our University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we're here with Tammy Milillo today. Thank you for being here, Tammy.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're so excited to learn about this topic. And before we get into her presentation, my quick housekeeping and we are recording the session. So if all goes as planned, I'll be able to post it on our website in the near future. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. As Tammy goes through her presentation, feel free to type any questions or comments in that chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have here today. If you're new to us, your chat box is located likely at the lower right-hand side of your screen. If you're on a computer, send your questions right to me. Don't forget to click send. And if you're on a tablet or smartphone, touch your screen. That brings up your control panel. You'll see a circle with 3 dots, and there you'll have your chat. So we hope you get all your questions and things answered today. Quickly, we'll thank our sponsors, which is our Department of Senior Services, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And Senior Services is 858-8526 if you need anything. And now let's learn about the star of our show. Tammy is a research scientist in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. She's also a research assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry, so she's very busy. Her expertise is in analytical environmental chemistry and geostatistical modeling, and she has completed 20 years of community-based public participation research. Flip my page there in Western New York. These include Seneca Babcock, Hickory Woods, Lewiston Porter, 858 East Ferry, 18 Mile Creek, Delavan Grider, and most recently with the Tonawanda Coke Soil Study, which she's here to talk with us about today. Tammy, the floor is yours. I've lost your video, but I'm assuming you're still there. Thank you for being
Yes,
here.
I'm here.
Okay,
Can you
great.
guys hear me?
Yep, you sound great. It's all yours.
Okay. So if you can go off the title slide. As Katie was mentioning, I happen to do quite a bit of research and work on the environment in a lot of these areas. So we're going to talk, though, more about what I do at Tonawanda Coke. We'll talk about some of the history of the land use and the company and sort of what precipitated these research studies and sort of some of the legal issues that were there, as well as the chemistry and the health concerns. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the proposed remediation is, where that is at the moment, and um, the ongoing parts of it. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we'll talk about the coking process a little bit. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this slide actually, I was requested to put this slide in by the Coca-Cola plant because when we started the soil study, they actually called me and said, could you please explain to people that Tonawanda Coke is not the Coca-Cola plant? So Coke is not the Coca-Cola plant, and we will get into what is it. You can go to the next slide. All right, so you'll see in the picture on the top, there's a piece of coal, the darker black, more porous looking rock. Everybody knows it as the fuel source. And then you see at the bottom, what is coke? Okay, coke looks more of like a volcanic rock. It's very high carbon content. It is what Tonawanda Coke made. They specifically make foundry coke. So this is another fact that people didn't particularly understand. You do need to have coke to make steel, but this is not the type of coke that they had. They had high carbon containing or very pure coke, which was used in the fires or the ovens to make this steel. So it's foundry coke. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this image I very graciously was given by Nellie Brown, who was one of the main chemist and hygiene in the chemist at Tonawanda Coke for a number of years. And this is sort of a schematic of what the oven looked like. The thing that people don't realize is the raw material is actually dropped in at the top of the diagram. And so it kind of looks like a toaster with the slits. And the coal and the material was added from the top. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a cross section of one of these little slits, right? The first image A, is about halfway through the process. You can sort of see from the diagram that the coke actually forms on the sides of the oven. And then as the process goes through, the materials of the coal that are not turned into coke go towards the middle, and then they get all, by the end of the process, they're removed, and you are left with this column of coke, if you will, and that's where they got it from. It is a self-sustaining process, so the gases and the energy created keeps fueling the process, and it can run, in essence, indefinitely in this way. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so as the chemist, and I'm sure if you guys have been watching the news or watching what was going on in the process and why there was some legal entanglements and whatever, that PAHs were detected. PAHs are polyaromatic hydrocarbons. They are a known class of carcinogen. And because of that, obviously, that raises concern. They are part of the benzene family. They are aromatic rings. And they're also very they're from not incomplete combustion. So when things burn, you form these when you do barbecue pits, when you do campfires, when you smoke cigarettes. You can also be forming PAHs and then exposing yourself to them. If you go to the next slide. So, as I was saying, the PAHs are part of the particulate matter that are formed in the burning process. And so there's two particular types of particulate matter. They're distinguished by the dimension of the particle. So PM 2.5 is very small. You can see that by the pink dots. Okay, the diameter is 2.5 nanometers. In comparison to the hair in the diagram, you can see how small that is. Why that is a concern is because that size of particle can go through and enter into your lungs and cause respiratory problems. PM2 or PM10 is another type of particulate matter which also does pose danger, but this size of a particle will most likely or less frequently enter into respiratory tracts. You can go to the next slide. You can, now we'll go into a little bit of the history of Tonawanda Coke, what's involved in the process, sort of what started all these studies, and we'll go from there. You can go to the next slide. So this is the picture that anyone in Buffalo that's lived here for years saw when they looked across to Grand Island. You see the smoke, you see the stacks, you see it from either the Grand Island side or the Tonawanda. This was the prominent image of the company. You can go to the next slide. All right, so Tonawanda Coke, as far as a company land use, opened as Allied Chemical in 1917. When it opened in 1917, it was state of the art for the formation of the Coke. And at that time, they had one battery of ovens. They did add a second battery, which ran in the cooking process for a couple of years in the 40s. And then it was actually seen that the newer ovens were more expensive to run, had problems with cracking. So they went back to using the 1917 ovens, and those ovens, that battery of ovens, was used until they closed in 2018. 1978 was officially when J.D. Crane bought the company, and it turned into what we now know as Tonawanda Coke. You can go to the next slide. Okay, in 2007, 2008, the EPA and DEC did do a monitoring of the air in the area. This was initiated by a community environmental group, which did 8 to 9 self-collected air samples that did contain a large amount of benzene. They did collaborate with, at the time, who was my PhD advisor, as well as myself, to look at these samples. We did run these samples, and then we further went to the DEC. When they saw these results, they then decided that they would run an air monitoring program. You'll see the picture on the right side of the screen is an example of what the air monitor looked like. And this is what started people being concerned about the practices of the company. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so as a result of this study and the study that we did as part of UB, it was seen that Tonawanda Coke had perhaps falsified their toxic release inventory, or the report that they are required to provide to the DEC and EPA of what they are emitting, because they do have permits which allow them to permit or emit a certain amount of pollution. However, they were found in violation of those things. And this was decided by the court in March of 2013. It was appealed and denied, so that no actual fines or processes had been turned over or started till about 2017, even though it says January 2016 there. It is important to note here that this is the first time that any industrial company had been fined under the Clean Air Act, and as part of this fine, they were found guilty and were told that they had to fund 2 studies, both of which I had the pleasure of working on: the Tonawanda Coke Soil Study and now the Environmental Health Study. And we'll go into detail about what those were and the process a little bit later. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so in 2018, they ceased the current production of coal in the area. Okay, and then they got multiple notices of the violations as a result. Then there was a fire, and they owed fines as a result of those things. And then TCC was ordered to make their final community payment, which they actually didn't make to the health study. And the shutdown was announced, and then they were finally closed. But the initial intent was not to close Tonawanda Coke. The Judge Scrutiny, very clearly wanted to work with them to fix the problems that were found in why they were violating things, and try to be a good steward of the industry as well as the environment. But when they were brought back into court for violating their probation, they were actually, that's really what forced the shutdown. You can go to the next slide. So as I said, there were 2 studies that were funded. There was a 2-year soil study, which actually ended up taking about 3 years, and then the current ongoing 10-year health study from the impact of Tonawanda Coke. And the thought of Judge Cretney was he wanted the soil study to tell us a little bit of what was impacted in the environment, and then the health study was a longitudinal study that will look at the impact to the residents in the area. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to go through a little bit of the soil study now. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so the soil study was a 2-phase study. In the first phase, we wanted to identify where is the boundaries of the contamination. So in what area was it impacted, how much is there, what is there, and what are the things we have to look and or worry about. And then in phase 2, if we identified regions of interest, where were they, firm up the boundaries, and then look at remediation if necessary, and then to communicate those findings to the residents or potential at-risk populations, and try to limit the exposures to those things. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so benzoate pyrene equivalents, this is the EPA's way of determining and or deciding what the concentration of the pHs in an area are. You can think of it as a ratio, because there are 16 different carcinogenic pHs. Not all of them have the same type of toxicity or potency. So the benzoate pyrene equivalence is a way to, it essentially creates a ratio, so you have a way of comparing different contaminants. The DEC does measure these by the individual components, where the EPA looks, you can go to the next slide, this goes into a little more detail, looks at the ratio of all those things together. So I just put up one map because, as Katie said in my intro, there were some fancy words of geostatistician and environmental chemist, and what does all this mean? Well, it means I can make fancy looking maps like the one on the right side of your screen. And this was looking at benzoate pyrene equivalents. And so I always get the thought of, wow, it looks so dark, we must be all contaminated. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Well, I mean, fortunately, it is not the case. Unfortunately, as the color darkens, the concentration does increase, but we will, as I said, be able to find some amount of this just naturally in the environment as a result of the other processes, like the burning of fossil fuels, your barbecue grills, your campfires, cigarette smoking. There are many other sources of this type of contaminant. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so a more simplified version of that map shows that the blue dotted lines or blue outlines were the regions of interest that were identified as a result of the soil study. No surprise that the area right around Tonawanda Coke was an area of interest. There was a small area of interest on Grand Island, as well as in the upper north area, the circle that is above the square there. And so, as a result of the soil study, what we found is in the circle above the square of the Tonawanda Coke Square, what we found there was not only PAHs, but also PCBs, which are made in plastics. Now, they are not made in the cooking process, so this was kind of concerning to us. But I should say that Tonawanda Coke in the legal documents were fined, and as part of the conviction, for burning illegal waste from other companies. So it is thought that they burned some waste, perhaps from the applied polymer plastics, which is also located up there. And that could be also the source of the PCBs. That is, as much as we can tell, conjecture from what we found. The small area in Grand Island was highlighted not by pH concentration, but arsenic. So we did do in the soil study a full suite of chemicals, including heavy metals, as well as PCBs and PAHs, because we know that this area is an industrial area with a long history of industrial use, and these are potential contaminants. And so we did a full suite. We were charged by the judge to very specifically identify the concentrations of contaminants in the environment, and then to later assign what portion of that Tonawanda Coke may be responsible for. You can go to the next slide. And this just kind of goes through a little bit of what we found. Two of the schools were where the high arsenic concentrations were found, and that has already been cleaned up. The source of the arsenic was found to be from what we believe to be railroad ties that were used in a playground, as well as the boundaries for one of the parking lots in the high school. So those areas have been found, dug up, and remediated. You can go to the next slide. Okay, due to COVID, the source apportionment, or the process of saying how much was specifically related to Tonawanda Coke, has been completed, but has not been shared with the community. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we could not have a community meeting. So there will be an upcoming community meeting to share that part of the results in January. And I gave you the Facebook page as well as the web page that is assigned to this project on the chemistry. We are going to try to get the word out there so that people that are interested in the results can certainly come and see them. It is very unfortunate that I have done this work about 2 years ago and we have yet to communicate it. But this will be an upcoming event. You can go to the next slide. This was a team effort that both Dr. Joseph Gardella and myself PI'd the project from the UB side. Professor Mike Milligan helped us in the processing of source samples, so air samples that came directly from the stack for Tonawanda Coke. This process was instrumental in that source apportionment, because in essence we could fingerprint what the contaminants look like coming out of the stack and then compare that to what we found in the soil. So the three of us have been working on that. Kathleen Izzard was a wonderful community outreach coordinator who helped to coordinate all the moving pieces of the community actually going out and helping us do soil samples. We took over 300 samples for the project, and we had a whole team of students that really put some time into analyzing. And I should say that all of the soil samples collected were sent to an EPA certified lab. They were not done at UB, and that was so that if there was anything found where it was vitally important to maybe any kind of legal proceedings, it was done to EPA and DEC standards. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the project that I'm working on now with a whole bunch of collaborators. There's a wonderful team of people that have been put together by the Epidemiology and the School of Public Health, and you'll see that whole list later, but let's kind of go through a little bit of this. Okay, so the goals here are to characterize and to evaluate the health status of the populations in the city, town of Tonawanda and Grand Island, and to learn about the multiple effects caused by low-level chronic environmental and industrial exposure on certain health outcomes. It is very important to note that many people maybe get the impression that you're exposed to environmental contaminants in a large amount and then you develop something. It is unfortunately not that direct cause and effect relationship, specifically when you get low levels. So it may even be at the level that DEC or EPA says by some guideline that you're within a certain safety. But what happens when you're exposed to that every day, day in and day out, or just a little bit above? What happens? I have worked in the past at in collaboration with Roswell and looking at correlations with other illnesses, and there's something known as a latency period. So just because you were exposed last week or last year or last month doesn't mean that we know what that time period is. I can say for some of the illnesses that we were looking at in other projects, the latency period was around 20 years. So just because you might even be moved out of the area, but you were exposed at some point in the past. So part of what we'll be looking at is residential histories of the survey respondents as well, to get an idea of what are we looking at as far as that is concerned. And then more unfortunately, you're not at the point where you might be getting more than one type of exposure. So do you smoke? Are you a bus driver? Do you live by the industrial traffic lines? Looking at all those things, lifestyle choices, as well as occupations, that type of stuff can add another avenue of exposure, if you will. And then our last, and I argue the most important goal, is to communicate that with people in the community so they can know or formulate a plan if they're being exposed, ways they can mitigate the negative effects. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so the area that we are interested in for the health study is slightly larger than the area that we took the 300 samples for the soil study in. And so you'll see here that the areas in purple in this map show the areas in the study area. However, we do have some people that responded outside this is the main study area, and we're hoping to be able to characterize this area especially. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a little flow chart. Currently, we have over 13,000 people that are participating in the health study. We are going to take biological samples, blood and urine as well, so we can look at people's health or exposure. Do they have contaminants that are found in their urine? And look at that as a function of time. Obviously, Tonawanda Coke has stopped producing, which that does help immensely as a way of limiting some exposures. And then from their survey responses, what changes. So right now we're done with the baseline survey, and we just sent out our first follow-up survey. So people will be filling out periodic follow-up surveys where they will let us know, have they been diagnosed with other conditions? Is there some change we need to know about? And then we're going to look at those things as a function of time. You can go to the next slide. So, as I said, we've got 13,000 people. We're doing the follow-up now. We have over 1,000 biological specimens. We're hoping that by looking at spatial distributions, we're going to start mapping contaminants, exposure, air to specific air pollutants, and then looking at, are there correlations to certain health effects, certain health outcomes as a function of time. You can go to the next slide. So, okay, why am I here? I am not a health doctor. I am many things, but an MD is not one of them. We're going to use mapping and geographic information science to add that third variable, that third element, and start to identify, are there at-risk populations that we can do things to protect if necessary, or are we seeing just everyday average exposures that we see in a lot of the Rust Belt areas? And what can we do to help identify that? Even if it's just give people the data in a usable way so that they can feel empowered in becoming environmental advocates for themselves. You can go to the next slide. So to give you an idea, we are working on maps of the initial study, but those are not done. I thought this would be an interesting map. So this map here shows our study area and shows on this study area both DEC and EPA Superfund sites or brownfield sites, all of which pose an environmental hazard to the communities, most of which are being monitored. But this shows you in our area how many industrial places we have. You can go to the next slide. So as I said before, we're going to keep looking and at the survey responses. We're going to start mapping those. We're going to do air exposure modeling. We're going to bring in things such as traffic patterns as much as we can, information on smoking for our cohort of people. Any information that they provide us in the survey that would help us to make a model, an accurate model of what our exposures are and what we can do to limit those, and then applying what portion of that might come or might have come from exposure from Tonawanda Coke is what we will be doing. You can go to the next slide. Okay, So when I've given talks in the past, one of the things that I most frequently get asked is, how can I find out what's going on in the study? And there's a phone number there as well as an email. There's now a Facebook page. There's a website to let you know what's going on. And if you either have not received a survey, want to participate, there is the website, the link to the website there will provide you an online link to the survey, or if you really prefer a paper copy, feel free to reach out to us and we can provide you with a paper copy. You can go to the next slide. Okay, as I said before, we have a very large team. This is the list of many people who have gotten together to do this kind of study. I should mention that this is the first health study of its type to have such an extent of time to look at the effects of the health study, to look at the effects of, like I said, low-level chronic exposure. So this is really exciting, and the fact that we have the results of the soil study to go along with it makes it extremely useful. You can go to the next slide. And so this is the next question that I get asked a lot. Well, what's being done on the site? You can go to the next slide. Okay, so the proposed NYS-DEC remediation plan, it was released in 2017, and it's many pages, but the long and short of it is that they are going to remove what could be removed, either selling to other companies the coal or coke stockpiles, coal tar. They are going to try to remediate what they can with the above ground storage tanks and discharge into the river. That's another thing you'll see on the next slide. There's a map. Many people don't realize that Tonawanda Coke also has a parcel property right on the river, which is not by the main site, so there'll be some cleanup going on there. There's also asbestos abatement that's going on for some of the older buildings, as well as part of the property. If you guys have been following the news, there was an auction, I think about a year ago now, maybe a little bit over that, where Allied Chemical, which was the first owner of the property, has bought back a portion of the property, because some of the contamination found was a result of that. So they bought it back and will be taking care of part of the remediation. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this actually just came, I say just, but very recently, the DEC has released the record of decision for the Tonawanda Coke site. And as a result, in March, the EPA and DEC started this as a joint remediation effort. The EPA took immediate control of the site. They worked with the employees and the corporate people to safely shut down and help to maintain the site, because one of the things that people don't necessarily know is that it's not like you flick a switch and the coke oven stop. It's a sustaining process, so it actually had to sort of burn its way out or settle itself down. There's a safe way to do that. They jumped in, they started doing that right away. It was initially broken into 5 parcels of land. 2 by the EPA, and 3 by the DEC. Now that's been somewhat consolidated into 2 sites. The EPA will maintain control of the site that's by the river, section that's known as Site 108, and then the main site that has the building and the places where people know the stacks will be in the DEC control. There are going to be parts of the property that will most likely stay indefinitely contaminated, so it's going to be a matter of maintaining it so it doesn't spread, trying to limit that. And as I said here, the stacks have officially come down on the 27th, in June. They were dismantled. Things are happening rather quickly. There is a proposed plan to put a computer manning site. So it's going to be a computer-based company where people will just come and do computer work. There will be other parts of the land that's going to be capping and whatnot. I think as they go through and do monitoring of certain parts of the site, you will see changes to this plan, but that is the current state of affairs, if you will. You can go to the next slide. And so, as I said, they've done some asbestos remediation. They've removed the stockpiles of coal and coke. Coal tar, they actually auctioned off some of that as well. They've removed what they can of the hazardous material off the site. They will be doing monitoring. The EPA is going to probably have my suspicion is it will be officially declared. The waterfront site will be officially declared a EPA Superfund site and will be put on the Superfund list. And the rest of the process is an ongoing process, but they are slowly getting things back in order, which by slowly I mean for remediation purposes, it's quite quick. I've been involved in processes that had equal amount of contaminant, but took far longer to clean up, and to get the money to do so. So I think they are doing a fairly decent job. Some of it is going to be ongoing, but it's the best they are doing a fairly quick and efficient removal of what they can. You can go to the next slide. And with that, I'm open to any of your questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Tammy. That was really wonderful. And we do have a couple questions here, but before we get to that, because we have a couple folks that are calling in, could we ever get that phone number for the paper survey? Could you just read that for us, please?
Yeah, that's 716-829-5625.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure they could capture that. Whoops. All right, so this first question that I'm seeing is, where is the Coke produced now that TCC was doing, and do they have the same problem?
Okay, so this is part of the anecdotes that I usually give. I was concerned about time. JD Crane had actually unfortunately done this in about 5 other places. So Tonawanda Coke is officially closed. There's no Coke being made by them. But before they came up here, they were in Pittsburgh. They've been in 2 different places, I believe, Pittsburgh and Detroit. He ran the same thing, and there's an even bigger mess there. And I just got contacted by some people in Erie to give my comments on that problem down there. They've also done this in places down south, other places. He actually, J.D. Crane, I believe, had throughout his career 5 such industries, all of which have now been closed with the closure of Tonawanda Coke. It is, I mean, there are still places that do it, that have a coking industry, but Tonawanda Coke is officially closed.
Okay, thank you for that information. This next question I'm seeing is, did the employees have any health issues that we know of yet?
So that's really difficult to say, because the and I should say that my team, I unfortunately, because I am in a wheelchair, was told when I went to go on site to take the soil samples that my wheelchair would not be able to go on site. So I had to send members of my students and my other colleagues, the other PIs on the project, had to go to take the soil samples. And those employees were very professional, very nice. They knew they would be facing foreclosure. You know, there was a health facility there for them, but we don't necessarily know what um what what they were monitoring. We do know that they did have what we call air monitoring badges, where they would be able to look at the badge and know what they were exposed to after analyzing it. It's not like an instant process. There were proper safety equipment, but by the time we were granted access to the site, it was well after the better, air quality safety measures had been put in place. So the problem is, this has been going on obviously for over 100 years now. And obviously, once some of those upgrades to deal with some of the pollutant problems were taken care of, it would have been less exposure. So evaluating what that is not straightforward as a result.
I can certainly understand that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
This next question is, was the bed of the Niagara River and the water tested as well?
So um the Tonawanda Coke employed Nellie Brown. She's one of the person that I plugged in the middle of this presentation for giving us the schematics of the oven. She was actually a water chemist, so there was certain things that they did as part of their process to monitor the water. Unfortunately, the two funded studies, the 2 research studies, are looking at air and soil. Part of that is because obviously water is fluid. There's many industries in that area. In fact, and maybe you can see this a little bit from the one map I showed of DEC sites. In our study area, that 2-mile radius that we're looking between Tonawanda Coke and Grand Island is the most densely populated area that is allowed for the emission of air pollution permits. So they have the largest number of industries that have been granted said permits. Um, so it becomes a much more difficult scenario than to separate out who did what.
That makes a lot of sense too. Wow, okay. I'm just seeing one more question here, and you touched on this, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but oh, okay, things are popping in. Let's see, this is, where is the excavated soil sent?
So that is not a straightforward answer, because it depends what is found in the soil. And ironically, most of the excavated soil gets sent to Lewiston Porter, which is another area which I've done extensive environmental work on. So this is, and if it's radioactive, it's sent to the, to the radioactive site. If there's, it really depends what the concentration of the contaminant is, what the contaminant is, to answer that. And that's why doing that type of excavation and then moving of soil is not as easy as everyone's just like, well, dig it up and move it. And any place we go to move that, no one wants that in their backyard. And so where we put it, how we put it, is it full, is it not full? It all depends on the size, what's in there. It's not a straightforward answer.
Okay. Thank you, Tammy. I can see why people wouldn't want that around them.
Yeah,
Knowingly, anyways. Um,
exactly.
this one is, say your home lies outside the study borders, but you're curious about your own possible levels of soil contamination for the contaminants being studied here. Is there anything you would recommend to such homeowners?
Yes. Well, okay. So this is a fact that a lot of people don't realize. If you are a homeowner, you can go on to the DEC and EPA sites, and if there has been sampling on your property or around your property, there is a database, if you will, of what sampling has been done, what's been tested. You are entitled to find out that information, and all you have to show is that you are the homeowner, and that will be provided. And I did not put those websites on this presentation here, but I will offer that um, you can give out my email, and anyone that's interested, feel free to email me, and I will provide the information.
Thanks, Tammy. So yeah, contact me if you want Tammy's information. You can email me. You should have my email, or give me a phone call at 858-7605. And Tammy, I'm just seeing one more thing, if that's okay. Do you have
That's
time?
fine. Yeah.
Okay. This is, how do you know where to take the soil from?
For soil samples.
It doesn't say, but I would assume so.
Okay, so for the soil study, as we mentioned in the very beginning, I'm a geostatistician and also a chemometrician. So those are fancy words to say that I do mathematical chemistry. And there are certain techniques and methods. The map that you saw with the color as it went from lighter to darker, indicating concentrations, was an estimate. So we know certain concentrations. We look at spacing them equally as a grid, and we try to get as close to that grid as possible because we're using distance as a measure to help us to understand the spread and extent of contamination. So the really quick way is I use math to mathematically know what I'm doing is correct.
Wow, that is just so cool.
Yeah,
Holy cow. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that to us.
no problem.
I'm not seeing anything else, so we can just give it another second here if there's any other thoughts. Tammy, if you're looking at your chat box, could you ever pull that up for me? Just, I want to make sure we're not missing
Sure.
anything.
I don't think we are, but let me see.
Okay. All right. It looks like most of the things came to me privately.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't see any in my chat box.
Okay.
Um,
All
oh,
right. Well then, oh, do you see something?
I thought so, but no. It's
Oh,
one I already answered. So no.
okay. Well, thank you to everyone who was on for this class. And Tammy, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.